By patron request, it's a massive Datach.
We follow orders or people die.
Last year, I dove into the history of the Camerica Aladdin Deck Enhancer, a device that plugged into the cartridge slot of the Nintendo Entertainment System to become a slot for an even smaller cartridge. Now, by request of Joseph Wawanek, here's its Japanese counterpart, the Datach Joint ROM System from Bandai. There must have been something in the water in the early 90s, because both the Aladdin and the Datach arrived in 1992 and both did essentially the same thing. As with the Aladdin, Bandai's concept for the Datach promised players the opportunity to purchase reduced-cost games by creating a device that contained a universal set of the chips required to make NES cartridges function in the system. By offloading those standardized functions to a peripheral, the Datach allowed Famicom owners to make a one-time peripheral purchase that handled the behind-the-scenes workload of most carts, meaning the mini carts it accepted need only contain chips that define the unique elements of each game: the program code, the music, and the graphics. The Datach itself cost only a little more than a standard Famicom cartridge, and it came with its own game. And the compatible mini cartridges that plugged into it only cost 3,000 yen, or about 30 bucks. Which represented quite a savings when the late-era Famicom carts could cost anywhere from 5,000 to 9,600 yen. There's no small irony in the economics of the Datach, because those super cheap games have become some of the most expensive Famicom titles to acquire complete in box in the aftermarket. I managed to track down the complete Aladdin set for less than $150 last year, whereas you'd be hard-pressed to find a single complete Datach cart besides the pack-in for less than that. The rarest and most coveted of its releases regularly sell for $1,500 or more a piece. That's dollars, $1,500, not yen. Why the difference? It comes down to a variety of factors. For starters, the Aladdin was not an official licensed release, whereas the Datach was. That makes a pretty significant difference for most collectors. People love their full sets of sanctioned games and tend to draw the line at collecting unlicensed releases. After all, it's easy enough to draw a line and classify a set complete when they wear the Nintendo seal of approval. But outside of that collection, what constitutes complete? Do you, for example, try to acquire every unlicensed NES game that shipped during the console's heyday? And if that's the case, do you look for the international versions of games that were released by the likes of Color Dreams in the US? If so, that means you go after the Hacker International set, which pulls you into collecting for the Famicom Disk System. Given the proliferation of obscure pirate creations for the disk system that circulated through Asia, how do you find a full set of those? And considering that developers like Sachin were making new Famicom and NES games well into the current century, overlapping with the advent of modern-day homebrew cartridge releases, should you then make an effort to collect today's thriving NES release scene? And so it goes. Once you add the Aladdin Deck Enhancer to your list, you're doomed to spiral down an infinite rabbit hole of sorrow. The Datach, on the other hand, fits right with the holy list of 1,000 or so Famicom releases Nintendo gave the okay to. And so, those acquisition-driven collector types look at the mediocre games Bandai sold on tiny carts, sigh, and allocate another 3,000 bucks or so to tracking down these hateful little things. Another factor is that being Bandai releases, Datach titles are naturally tied to popular Japanese media franchises. While most people could take or leave things like Ultraman Club and SD Gundam, for which no shortage of tie-in games appeared in the 8-bit era, other properties have a greater aura of desirability about them. Yu Yu Hakusho, for example, was a considerably less common subject for video game conversions, and the series has gained vastly more popularity outside Japan than it had in 1992, back when Yu Yu Hakusho Bakuto Ankoku Bujutsu Kai first debuted. Add to that the fact that the original Famicom was even more obsolete in 1992 than its American counterpart was, what with the Super Famicom having debuted a full 2 years earlier, and you have a formula for highly desirable releases shipped in small quantities. There is, however, an additional factor putting pressure on the Datach collector's market, and it's the entire hook Bandai used to sell the device: a barcode scanner. It wouldn't be enough for the Datach to simply give players an adapter to enable half-price games, oh no. No, Bandai had to tart up the whole stupid thing with a second layer of gimmickry. In addition to being a cartridge that contains its own cartridge slot, the Bandai Joint ROM System also included a barcode scanner to allow cross-compatibility with a series of Bandai-issued trading cards. This was a strange choice. In theory, the barcode scanner could have allowed Bandai to sell expansion packs or something to extend the value of their games. In practice, they did no such thing. As far as I have been able to determine, Bandai never sold add-on packs for the Dataq scanner or its games. Instead, most of the games that shipped for the peripheral simply came with a few dozen cards that were critical to the operation of the games. These did not add anything to the games, however. They simply unlocked material already programmed into the games. The Barcode enhanced games, for a certain value of the word enhanced, required players to swipe a card through the reader to perform even the most basic functions. For example, the pack-in title, Dragon Ball Z Gekito Tenkaichi Budokai, was simply a mediocre 8-bit fighting game based on the Dragon Ball series. But in order to play, you needed to make use of the included cards. Otherwise, you get hung up at the character selection screen. Rather than presenting players with the usual wall of character portraits to select from, Dragon Ball Z for Dataq opens with a sort of blank, windowed screen. It's not until you swipe the card for your preferred fighter that Goku or Vegeta or whoever shows up. The Dataq release included about 40 different cards, 24 of which allowed players to select characters ranging from the usual suspects like Son Goku and Krillin to story-specific entries like the androids and the Saibamen. Also included were a dozen item cards that could be paired with a character card to add bonus effects ranging from Bulma's 25% hit point boost to battlesuits that granted a defensive buff. All of this was coded into the game already. All the games do is simply activate them, a task that could just as easily have been accomplished through a menu selection screen. Bandai seems to have been making an effort to get in on the ground floor of what it saw as the next big thing in video gaming. The year before, former first-party aspirant Epoch had created a popular standalone gadget called Barcode Battler, which allowed kids to wage war against one another by scanning UPC codes from common household products. Epoch quickly turned its sights back to the console games market it had once hoped to dominate with devices like the Super Cassette Vision and Game Pocket Computer. At the end of 1992, the Barcode Battler 2 would arrive, a device with Famicom connectivity, capable of bringing its UPC-powered design to the console-loving masses. Before it arrived, however, Bandai beat Epoch to the punch with the Dataq. This corporate one-upmanship seems somehow fitting, given the various ways in which the two companies' histories were entangled. Epoch was arguably the #1 publisher of games for anime and manga properties Bandai didn't have locked down. Primarily Doraemon, but also Sylvanian Family, Lupin III, and Chibi Maruko-chan. Epoch had made its mark in gaming with one of Japan's first ever console hits, Pac-Pac Monster for the Cassette Vision system. Along with the Epoch Man Game & Watch style handheld, Pac-Pac Monster became Japan's most beloved direct ripoff of Pac-Man, which of course was an arcade hit created by Bandai's future corporate spouse, Namco. You could almost look at the Barcode trend as Epoch passing a torch of sorts to Bandai. Epoch had tried and failed to become a first-party console powerhouse with the Cassette Vision line, and Bandai would spend the remainder of the 90s trying and failing to take a bite of the console market with the Playdia, the Pippin, and the WonderSwan family. Anyway, the integration of barcodes simply forces players to go through an extra step in order to make use of the software they'd already purchased. Not that the Famicom audience was necessarily a stranger to the idea of juggling real-world gimmicks in order to play a game, of course. Nintendo had already explored that very idea with Rob and Gyromite, which was a simple enough puzzle platformer we'd controlled manually, and a murky challenge when accompanied by Rob. And it's a concept the game makers still love, given the brief popularity of Skylanders and Disney Infinity, and the fact that the Switch remake of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword will force players to buy a $30 amiibo toy in order to activate a built-in fast travel feature. At least Rob and Disney Infinity toys have shelf appeal and aren't easily lost. That's not so much the case for Dataq cards. With each of the device's 7 releases paired to dozens of cards apiece, these games are literally unplayable with just the standalone cartridge. As a matter of fact, a search for Dataq gameplay videos in the English language corners of YouTube mostly just turns up a bunch of so-called long plays in which someone with zero evident familiarity with a platform will boot up the game and give up at the first screen where they're meant to scan cards. You need to dip into the Japanese side of the video web to find proper playthroughs from people who know how the Dataq worked, and who maybe even have access to the actual cards. Unlike Epoch's device, the Dataq isn't really designed around compatibility with universal barcodes, although you can scan a 13-digit barcode, and sometimes it'll generate some sort of in-game element. For the most part, you're really supposed to use the cards and the barcodes that's shipped with the games themselves. Emulator support for Datach games remains pretty spotty here in the year of our Lord 2021. More than a quarter century after NES emulation first made a real splash in the nerdier quarters of the internet. A handful of emulators do appear to contain branches that support barcode input, though even this appears to be inconsistent and hard to utilize to its full extent. Flash cartridge devices like the EverDrive N8 support the Dataq as a mapper, but don't offer any means through which to input barcodes. For now, the most reliable way to play barcode-enhanced Dataq games without spending a ridiculous amount of money on complete games is to lean on the benevolence of ROM hackers. A modder by the alias Wangsitan has, within the past couple of years, hacked both the Dragon Ball and Yu Yu Hakusho games to allow players to select features locked behind barcodes with in-game button inputs. It's not an entirely perfect hack, but it beats getting hung up at the title screen. For those with access to the actual Dataq unit and cards, a few different Famicom sites offer scans of the cards. And since they use simple barcodes that basically work as Game Genie codes to activate features rather than feeding actual raw game data into RAM, as with the microstripes on Nintendo's e-reader cards, you can even simply look up the barcode's numeric values and use a barcode generator to create your own bootleg versions, which the scanner will treat as perfectly valid. I suppose it's theoretically possible that with the recording setup I use, a jailbroken Analog NT Mini capable of loading ROMs from an SD card, leaving the cartridge ports free, I could theoretically plug in the Dataq, load a ROM, and scan bootleg barcodes. That might be a novel party trick, but is it really worth all that hassle just to play another damned SD Gundam game? Absolutely not. Anyway, all of this adds up to make the Datach Joint ROM System one of the quirkiest, not to mention the most annoying, peripherals ever to ship for the Nintendo Famicom. Leave it to Bandai, huh?